The wind was the only thing that had a name for this place, and it spoke it in a long, mournful sigh across the high chaparral. For 10 years, Silas had been the valley's only other inhabitant, a man built on a scale meant for felling trees or breaking stone, living in a cabin that seemed to shrink around his shoulders. He was a monument to silence, his past buried so deep the headstone had long since weathered away. His days were a rhythm of necessity. The sun would crest the eastern ridge, spilling pale gold onto the dust, and he would rise. The squeak of the pump handle was his morning prayer, the splash of cold water on his face a daily baptism into solitude. He'd check the small perimeter of his world, the split-rail fence that was more a suggestion than a barrier, the trough for his aging mare, Promise, the stacked cords of wood that stood as a testament to his foresight against the biting winter. Everything he owned was worn to the shape of his life. The handle of his axe, smooth and dark with the oil of his hands. The tin coffee cup, dented on one side from a fall he no longer remembered. The scar that ran like a white river from his left temple into his hairline, a relic of the life he had fled, a life of noise and blood and men who spoke too much. In the evenings, firelight threw his immense shadow against the cabin walls, a dancing giant locked in a cage of his own making. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the roof beams, thick with unspoken grief and the ghosts of words he refused to give voice to. He was not waiting for anything. Waiting implies hope. Silas was simply enduring, letting the seasons scour him clean. The change came as dusk bled purple and orange across the horizon, the air growing still and heavy with the promise of night. Promise, his mare, snorted in her lean-to, a nervous sound that broke the evening's quietude. Silas paused, his hand resting on a fence post, the rough grain of the wood a familiar anchor. He scanned the vast, empty expanse. Vultures had been circling high to the south for 2 days, lazy black commas punctuation an indifferent blue sky, a silent omen he had noted but not dwelled on. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement in the gloaming, a shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the scrubland. It was not an animal. It was too deliberate, too pained. It stumbled, fell, then rose again, a testament to a will that had outlasted the body's strength. He stayed where he was, a statue of weathered hickory, as the figure resolved into the form of a girl, staggering toward the faint light of his cabin. She was small, and from the way she moved, wounded. As she drew closer, he could see the dark, tattered dress, the glint of sweat and terror on her face. She was Apache. He knew the look of her people, the proud set of their jaws, though hers was now clenched in agony. She reached the fence, her small hands gripping the rough-hewn rail he had set in place years ago. Her eyes, black and deep as a starless night, found his. There was no plea in them, only a raw, defiant fire that was on the verge of being extinguished. Then, her strength gave out. She didn't cry out. She simply folded, collapsing into a heap in the dust on the outside of his world, a wounded offering left at the gates of his solitude. The silence was shattered, not by a sound, but by a choice that now lay at his feet. He moved with a slowness that belied his size, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. Each step was a deliberation, a crossing of a line he had drawn around his soul a decade ago. He knelt beside her, the smell of blood and sagebrush sharp in the cool air. A dark stain blossomed on the side of her dress, high on the ribs. A bullet wound, he reckoned. Not clean. Jagged. He placed 2 massive fingers on her neck, feeling the frantic, thready pulse, a trapped bird beating against its cage. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. Fear warred with exhaustion. He expected a whimper, a word, but she offered only a fierce, burning silence that mirrored his own. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. The groan that escaped her was tight, bitten off. He carried her inside the cabin, away from the encroaching night and the circling eyes of the sky. The warm, close air of the small room smelled of wood smoke and coffee. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire structure. The worn wool blanket was a stark contrast to her dark skin. For a moment, he just stood there, a giant looking at the small, broken thing that had breached his defenses. The wound needed tending. He knew wounds. He knew the path of lead through flesh, the fever that followed, the clean fire of whiskey and the hot sear of a knife. These were skills from the life he'd left behind, tools he had prayed he would never need again. He moved to the hearth, stoking the embers, putting a pot of water on to boil. His movements were methodical, his face a mask of stone. He was no longer just a man enduring, he was a man with a purpose, and the weight of it settled on him like a shroud. The girl, whose name he would learn was Anaba, watched him with an animal's wariness. Her eyes tracked his every move as he gathered his meager supplies, a bottle of whiskey, a clean rag from a worn-out shirt, his sharpest skinning knife held for a moment in the firelight until the steel glowed cherry red. He brought them to the cot, setting them on a small crate beside her. "This will hurt," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse. She gave a short, sharp nod, her jaw set. He took the knife and sliced through the fabric of her dress, exposing the wound. It was ugly, a mangled tear in her side where a bullet had grazed her, tearing through muscle. He cleaned it with the rag and whiskey, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with hands like shovels. She hissed through her teeth, her small fists clenching the blanket, but she did not scream. He saw the resilience in her then, a core of tempered steel. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration, the flickering lantern light carving deep shadows into the lines on his face. When he was done, he had packed the wound and bound it tightly with more clean cloth. He offered her a tin cup of water, which she drank greedily. "They will come," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, barely audible. "Who?" Silas asked, though he already knew the answer. The world was full of men who shot at fleeing girls. "Men with stars," she said, her eyes closing. The sheriff. She drifted into an exhausted, feverish sleep. Silas sat in the single wooden chair across the room, his old rifle laid across his knees. He hadn't fired it in years, but his hands remembered its weight, its cold, deadly balance. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause before the thunder. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, a fragile rhythm in the heart of his fortress. The world he had shut out had finally found his door. They came 2 days later, just as the sun reached its cruel zenith, bleaching the color from the sky and land. Silas saw the dust cloud first, a rising plume of brown against the blue, miles down the valley. He woke Anaba, who was weak but clear-eyed, the fever having broken during the night. "They're here," he said. She needed no other explanation. She sat up, her hand instinctively going to her bandaged side, her face grim. Silas stood on his small porch, a silent, immovable figure, as 3 riders approached. The man in the lead was broad, with a sun-reddened face and a silver star pinned to a sweat-stained vest. Sheriff Clayton. His smile was all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a man who enjoyed his authority. "Howdy, giant," Clayton called out, reining in his horse a few yards from the cabin. His 2 deputies flanked him, their hands resting casually on their pistol grips. "Heard you had some company. Found some property of the U.S. government that went wandering off the reservation." Silas said nothing. His stillness was its own answer. "She's a thief," Clayton continued, his eyes scanning the cabin, lingering on the doorway. "Stole a side of beef and shot at a good man. We're here to take her back for justice. She's wounded," Silas rumbled, his voice flat and hard as bedrock. "Fell off her horse, I imagine," Clayton sneered. "They're clumsy like that. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No trouble for you." The air grew thick with unspoken violence. One of the deputies shifted, his horse stamping nervously. Silas didn't move a muscle, but his presence seemed to expand, to fill the space between them. His eyes, cold and grey as a winter storm, were fixed on the sheriff. He knew this kind of man. A bully who used his badge as a shield for his own cruelty. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the finality of a hammer blow. Clayton's smile tightened. "Now, listen here. You're a long way from the law, friend. It'd be a shame for things to get complicated." He let the threat hang in the shimmering heat. Silas slowly raised his left hand and pointed south, toward the distant, hazy mountains. "Get off my land." For a long moment, no one moved. It was a contest of wills, played out under the vast, indifferent sky. Clayton's eyes narrowed, measuring the giant of a man before him. He saw the certainty there, the absolute lack of fear. Finally, he gave a short, sharp laugh. "Have it your way," he said, pulling on his reins. "But we'll be back. And when we come back, we won't be asking so polite." He wheeled his horse around, his deputies following suit, and they rode away, leaving a trail of dust and menace in their wake. Silas watched until they were small specks in the distance, his jaw tight. He knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The dust settled, and a new kind of silence fell, one laced with the iron tang of impending conflict. Silas turned and went back inside the cabin. Anaba was standing by the small window, a silhouette against the harsh light. She had watched the entire exchange. She looked from his face to the rifle he still held in the crook of his arm. No words were needed. The lines were drawn. They were no longer a man and a girl, they were allies, bound by a shared enemy. He nodded toward the rifle. "You know how to use one of these?" She shook her head. He spent the next hour showing her, his large, calloused hands guiding her smaller ones. He demonstrated how to work the lever action, how to sight down the long barrel, how to load the cartridges one by one into the side gate. The smell of gun oil filled the small space, a perfume of grim preparation. She was a quick study, her movements economical and precise. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He saw in her the same focus she must have used to survive in the wilderness, the same intent that had carried her, wounded, to his door. He took her outside, to the base of the rock-strewn slope behind his cabin. He set a tin can on a boulder 50 yards away. "One shot," he said, handing her the heavy rifle. She braced it against her shoulder, the stock too long for her, the weapon ungainly in her arms. She took a deep breath, held it, and fired. The report was a flat crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The can didn't move. She worked the lever, the spent casing ejecting in a brass arc, and prepared to fire again, her expression one of intense concentration. While she practiced, Silas walked the perimeter of his property, his eyes not on the fence line, but on the land itself. He saw it not as a home, but as a battlefield. He noted the narrow arroyo that could hide a man, the steep incline that would slow a charge, the cluster of boulders that would provide the only solid cover. He was a man waking from a long slumber, the instincts of his former life returning with a chilling clarity. He knew Clayton would not come alone, and he would not come politely. This would be a fight to the finish. As the sun began to dip low, casting long, spidery shadows, Anaba finally hit the can. It spun into the air with a satisfying ping. A small, grim smile touched her lips for the first time. She looked at Silas, a silent question in her eyes. He simply nodded. The time for preparation was over. All that was left was to wait for the dawn. The dawn came not with light, but with shadow. A grey, pre-dawn gloom clung to the valley floor as Silas stood by the window, the cabin behind him steeped in darkness. He had not slept. Anaba was awake, too, sitting on the cot, the rifle across her lap. They were two silent figures waiting for the inevitable. He saw them as soon as they cleared the low ridge to the east, 6 riders moving at a steady, deliberate pace, black shapes against the lightening sky. Clayton was at their head. "They're coming," he said, his voice a low growl. Anaba joined him at the window, her face a stoic mask. "I will go to the high rocks," she said, her voice steady. It was not a question. It was a statement of strategy. He had shown her the place the day before, a small crevice in the rock face that overlooked the cabin and the approach, a perfect sniper's nest. He handed her a small pouch with extra cartridges. "Don't show yourself until you have a clean shot," he instructed. She nodded, her dark eyes meeting his. In them, he saw no fear, only a fierce resolve that matched his own. She slipped out the back of the cabin, a shadow melting into other shadows, and began the quick, silent climb. Silas watched her go, then turned his attention back to the approaching riders. He picked up the heavy wood-splitting axe from its place by the hearth. Its weight felt familiar, balanced. He would not wait for them in the cabin. That was a trap for him, not for them. He walked out onto the porch and stood in the open, the axe held loosely in his right hand, its polished head glinting faintly in the nascent light. The riders fanned out as they drew closer, forming a loose semicircle around the cabin, their rifles now drawn. Clayton pulled up 20 yards away, a cruel smirk on his face. "Last chance, giant," he shouted, his voice echoing in the morning stillness. "Give us the girl and we'll let you live out your miserable life in this dust bowl." Silas remained silent, a mountain of a man rooted to the earth, his presence a quiet act of defiance. The air was electric, the moment stretched taut. Clayton's smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl of impatience. "Fine," he spat, raising his rifle. "Light him up." The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire and splintering wood. Silas dove from the porch as the first volley tore into the cabin's facade, rolling behind the meager cover of the water trough. Wood chips and lead slugs whizzed past his head. He stayed low, the axe clutched in his hand, his heart hammering a steady, cold rhythm against his ribs. He was not a gunman. He knew his limitations. His strength was in proximity, in the brutal arithmetic of close quarters. The deputies, emboldened by his retreat, began to advance, spreading out, using the sparse cover of rocks and scrub brush. From the high rocks, a single, sharp crack echoed across the valley. One of the deputies cried out, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled back, his rifle falling to the dust. "Anaba!" The shot sent a ripple of confusion through Clayton's men. Their advance faltered as they searched the rocks for the unseen shooter. It was the opening Silas needed. He erupted from behind the trough, not toward the cabin, but away from it, charging toward the narrow, rock-choked arroyo at the edge of his property. It was a calculated risk, drawing their fire, pulling them into the terrain he had chosen. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet as he ran, a giant in motion, an impossible target. He scrambled down the steep bank into the dry creek bed, the sound of the pursuit close behind. The arroyo twisted and turned, a natural maze of stone and shadow. He knew every bend. He rounded a corner and flattened himself against the rock wall, the axe held ready. A moment later, a deputy appeared, his pistol raised, his eyes wide with the thrill of the chase. He never saw Silas. The axe swung in a swift, devastating arc. The fight was sudden, brutal, and short. Silas didn't pause. He moved deeper into the arroyo, a predator in his element, turning their numbers against them in the tight confines. Another crack from the rifle high above, and another cry of pain. Anaba was pinning them down, her shots measured and precise, preventing them from overwhelming him. It was a deadly duet, played out across the rugged landscape. The chaos of the firefight dwindled to a tense standoff. 2 of the deputies were wounded, a third lay still in the arroyo. The remaining men were hesitant, their confidence shattered. Clayton, seething with fury, dismounted and took cover behind a large boulder, firing blindly toward the high rocks. He was a man unaccustomed to resistance, and it had made him reckless. Silas saw his chance. He worked his way back out of the arroyo, using the contours of the land to stay hidden, circling around until he was behind Clayton's position. He rose from the brush like an apparition, silent and immense. "Clayton," he said. The sheriff spun around, his face a mask of shock and rage. He brought his rifle up, but Silas was already closing the distance. He threw the axe. It spun end over end, not as a weapon, but as a diversion. The flashing steel blade made Clayton flinch, a fatal hesitation. Silas crashed into him, a force of nature. The rifle discharged into the dirt as they went down in a tangle of limbs. The fight was no longer about guns or tactics. It was primal. Clayton was strong, a brawler used to getting his way through brute force, but Silas was something else entirely. He was bigger, stronger, and fueled by a cold, righteous anger that had simmered for a decade. Fists flew, grunts of pain and effort filled the air. Clayton landed a solid blow to Silas's side, sending a sharp, stabbing pain through his ribs, but Silas absorbed it, his focus absolute. He got his massive hands on Clayton's shoulders, pinning him to the ground. The sheriff struggled, his face purple with effort and hate. "She's just an Indian," he gasped, spittle flying from his lips. Silas's grip tightened, his gray eyes boring into the sheriff's. "She's a child," he growled, the words torn from his throat. He ended it not with a killing blow, but with a final, crushing application of pressure that left Clayton gasping and broken. Silas rose, his chest heaving, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek and a fire burning in his side. The surviving deputies, seeing their leader defeated, threw down their weapons and fled, their loyalty as shallow as their courage. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the groans of the wounded. The sun was high and hot now, beating down on the aftermath. Silas stood over the defeated sheriff, his shadow falling across the man's body. He retrieved his axe, its handle slick with sweat. He looked up at the high rocks, and after a moment, saw Anaba emerge from her hiding place and begin the careful climb down. Her face was grim, but her eyes were alive with a fierce, quiet pride. She had not been a victim. She had been a warrior. They met in the space between the cabin and the battlefield, the silence between them no longer tense, but filled with a profound, unspoken understanding. He saw the way she looked at his side, where blood was now seeping through his shirt. She tore a strip from the bottom of her dress and, without a word, began to clean and bind his wound, her touch firm and capable. They worked together to deal with the aftermath, a grim and quiet task. They rounded up the horses, retrieved the discarded weapons. The wounded deputies were left for whatever fate the desert would deal them. Clayton was bound and left slumped against a rock, a living message to any who might follow. As evening approached, a new set of figures appeared on the horizon, not with the aggressive posture of riders, but with the steady, flowing gait of people on foot. Anaba's people. She had made a signal, a thin wisp of smoke from a small fire she'd built, a sign he hadn't even noticed. They came into the small homestead, their faces like carved stone, their eyes taking in the scene without judgment. An old man, clearly the leader, approached Silas. He looked at the bound sheriff, at the scars of the battle on the cabin, and then at Silas himself. He spoke a single word in his own tongue, a word that sounded like gratitude. Anaba spoke to him quietly, her hands gesturing to Silas, to her wound, to the rocks. When she was finished, the old man looked at Silas again and gave a slow, respectful nod. It was time for her to go. There was no long farewell. Anaba stepped forward and pressed something small and smooth into Silas's palm. A single, perfect eagle feather, bound at its base with a thin strip of leather. He, in turn, pressed into her hand a small, crudely carved wooden bird he had been whittling the night before the attack. Their fingers brushed. It was the only touch that passed between them. She turned and joined her people, and he watched them walk away, their forms slowly dissolving into the vast, indifferent landscape until they were gone. He was alone again, the silence returning, but the valley no longer felt empty. For a long time, Silas stood there, the eagle feather resting in his palm. He looked at his cabin, scarred by bullets, a testament to the violence that had broken his peace. He looked at his hands, which had once again remembered the brutal work they were made for. The silence that settled back over the valley was different. It was not the hollow silence of isolation, but the quiet resonance of a deed done, a choice made. The wind still whispered its mournful name across the chaparral, but it sounded less like an ending and more like a breath. He went inside and placed the eagle feather on the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the hearth. It was a small, fragile thing in a room built of solid, unyielding materials, a symbol of the resilient life he had protected. He had sought refuge from the world, but the world had found him anyway, not with an army, but with the quiet plea of a single, wounded soul. He had answered. And in answering, the giant who lived alone had found that the walls he had built around himself were not as strong as the conviction that lay sleeping within his heart. There is a silence that starves the soul, the silence of isolation chosen out of fear and grief. But there is another silence, the one that falls after a storm, the one that holds the weight of a difficult choice bravely made. Strength is not measured by the walls we build to keep the world out, but by our courage to tear them down when justice for the vulnerable demands it. A person's true worth is not found in their ability to endure their own pain, but in their willingness to stand for someone who cannot stand for themselves. The world is full of corrupt authority and silent victims. It is full of giants who have retreated into their own quiet valleys, hoping the storm will pass them by. Do not mistake solitude for peace. Do not mistake silence for strength. Look for the person whom the world has cast out. Listen for the injustice that no one is speaking of. Be the one who stands. Be the one who acts. Find your voice, not in words, but in courage.